Hi everybody, Dr. Kauza here. I'd like to take a few minutes and put a video on to talk about another school of philosophy which influences people's study of history to a great degree, and that's Marxism and the works of Karl Marx. When you looked at Joan Scott's article on gender, several of you noticed that, among other things, Scott addressed feminist historians who have been influenced by Marxism or who take a Marxist approach. And that's just one example of the kind of influence that Marxism has had. It's a very important movement, very significant in developing the historical field and the way that historians approach things. And so as part of our growing understanding of historiography, of different approaches to history that have been taken in different times, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of Marxism. Most of you are probably familiar with the name of Karl Marx as the founder of communism. Most of you have probably heard of communism, might associate it with communist China or with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and think of it mostly in this political kind of a sense, all of which is quite accurate. Marxism is very important as a political philosophy. But that political philosophy also has significant ramifications for how one thinks about history. Okay, and that's what I want to talk about here. Try and get an understanding of where Marx's ideas were coming from and how those ideas impact the study of history. Marx was active over the course of the 19th century. He had a long life. He published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, a year when there were a series of revolutionary movements breaking out in many different countries across Europe, continued to be active down through the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s. He was basically a philosopher by education and was influenced by an older philosopher by the name of Hegel, another German. Both Marx and Hegel were German philosophers. And Hegel had a very powerful idea we call the Hegelian dialectic. Okay, this idea of dialectic came from Hegel when Marx picked up on it. Hegel's idea was this. He was influenced by Romanticism. And Hegel's idea was that there is an idea that drives each culture in each era in history, sort of the fundamental underlying principle or concept or idea which captures and drives the spirit of that culture, the spirit of that era, the spirit of that people. He used the German term Zeitgeist, which means the spirit of the age, sort of a Hegelian term to express this idea that when you look at any given moment in history, any given culture, maybe the ancient Greeks or Romans or the Middle Ages or something, there's a zeitgeist, a kind of a driving idea which gives it its particular flavor and characteristics. Okay, so that's this Hegelian idea of zeitgeist. And Hegel's idea was that for any given era, you have this fundamental idea, which you could call a thesis, right? A thesis fundamentally being an idea. Every age, every culture has its thesis, but then that thesis automatically gives rise to its antithesis, right? As people are pursuing that thesis, pursuing that idea, you get people who dissent from it, people who criticize it or challenge it, and so you have this struggle between the thesis and the antithesis, between the idea of the culture and the opposing idea. And then what happens is, as the struggle goes on, as the argument goes on through the culture over the course of generations, gradually both break down and come together into a synthesis. Okay, so you have the thesis of the culture driving it, the rise of an antithesis to that, and then a transformation with the rise of a synthesis, a new idea which blends together the elements of both of the older two ideas, or sort of arises in place of both of them, and that synthesis then marks a watershed where you now move into a new era of history, a new zeitgeist, in which the synthesis from the old culture becomes the thesis of the new culture. That is going to give rise to a new antithesis, which in turn the new thesis, the new antithesis are going to struggle over centuries or generations until you give rise to yet another synthesis, right, which then becomes the thesis for yet a third generation of history. Okay, and this sort of goes on and on and on. Through the centuries, civilizations rise, built around a particular thesis, a particular idea, a particular spirit. An antithesis arises, there's a struggle, gives rise to a synthesis, and then a new era of history where the old synthesis is the new thesis for this kind of second generation, and this cycle keeps on repeating itself. Okay, so that's Hegel. What you see in Hegel is this idea that he's come up with a philosophy of history which is meant to explain historical change, explain why civilizations rise and fall and new civilizations take their place. And Hegel, being a philosopher, sees this process of history as fundamentally being about ideas, right? There's sort of a Greek idea, a Greek spirit, which is going to give rise, then ultimately will give way to a Roman spirit, which will then give way to a medieval spirit, and then a Renaissance spirit, and then the Enlightenment spirit, so on and so forth, as these ages of history move on and on. Okay, so this is this idea of Hegelian dialectic. Okay, it's dialogue, struggle between thesis, antithesis, giving rise to a synthesis, and then the cycle continually repeating itself. So that's where Marx's education was, that's where his background was thinking in terms of these Hegelian dialectics. But Marx was very struck by economic changes that were happening in the 19th century. Industry was spreading, industrialization was going on, often called the Industrial Revolution, and was really changing the way that people lived, the way that society was organized, the way that politics operated, all sorts of things had happened. And also Marx was looking at the revolutions that had occurred before he was born, in his childhood, with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and then ongoing revolutionary movements, not quite as successful, that had been going on in the 1820s and 1840s, and that he himself contributed to through the rest of the 19th century, right, the sort of age of revolutions. And Marx believed these were connected. And his big breakthrough was to say, maybe what's going on in history is that these transitions from culture to culture are marked by revolutions. Okay, when you see a revolutionary movement, you're seeing a sign that one era, one zeitgeist is coming to an end and a new one is being born. Okay, so the revolutions mark the transitions for Marx between different eras. But then the big place where he departed from Hegel was that he suggested that the dialectical process, this ongoing cycle of thesis and antithesis and synthesis, Marx thought this was not a matter of ideas and spirit in a different culture. He thought it was a dialectic of economic structures, okay, economic systems. And what you had was an ongoing dialectic of economic models and economic behaviors, and these were what really gave rise to revolutions, and these were what really drove the engines of history. Okay, so big difference. Both Hegel and Marx following this idea of dialectic, but for Hegel, the dialectic is a dialectic of ideas. For Marx, it's a dialectic of economic systems. Okay, different economies rising and falling. And then Marx went back and looked through history, and he argued that what you see from era to era of history are different kinds of economies going on. He argued that in the ancient world of the Greeks and Romans, what you were looking at was fundamentally a slave economy, an economy of masters and slaves. And this was how production was managed and wealth was created, by owning slaves and exploiting slaves for their labor. He thought that when the Roman Empire collapsed and the Middle Ages arose to take its place, you saw a shift in economy away from a relationship of slave and slave owner, and instead you moved towards an economy driven by peasants and lords, okay, where, again, you have sort of the subordinated, oppressed working class and a class of masters or owners, but it's a different type of relationship. The types of connections and responsibilities and obligations and exploitation between lords and their peasants for Marx was different than the old one between masters and slaves that you had in the ancient world. And then he thought that what was happening as he got into modern times was that this old, what he called a feudal economy, modern medieval historians don't like the term feudal, but what Marx called this feudal economy of lords and peasants, gave way to a new economy built around capitalists and the bourgeoisie, okay, the rise of capitalism. And he thought this was a third great era of economic relations, and that the American and French revolutions were driven by the transition, the sort of rise of the bourgeoisie, by which he meant a sort of basically the descendants of the old medieval merchant class, but who were now becoming the owners and managers of factories, and the old medieval peasants working the fields in agriculture were now turning into the proletariats, which is to say the working class factory laborers of the industrial age. Okay, so this new economic model with the rise of the factory, the rise of the capitalist bourgeoisie, the rise of the proletariat factory workers was causing revolutions to take place, which were in turn giving rise to new political systems. And Marx believed that capitalism, in turn, would produce its own antithesis, and that antithesis would be communism and would lead to yet a final wave of revolutions in which the proletariats would overthrow the capitalists and put an end to private property altogether, and you would finally reach a new era of a classless type of society. Okay, so this is Marx's idea of history. You can see, by the way, how this gives rise to communist revolutions in Russia and China and places like that. It's a theory of history, which is also an ideology. It justifies revolutionary movements, gives a motivation for revolutionary movements, saying that the course of history inevitably leads to a revolution in which the exploited workers will rise up against the capitalists and overthrow them and create a new society for themselves, right? So this is, the revolution and the political systems of communism we see in the 20th century are rooted in this philosophy of history that Marx is doing, okay? So very powerful set of ideas, really motivated a lot of people and changed the way people looked at history. It really was very significant in the shift from pre-modern history to modern history, even for people who were not themselves necessarily Marxists. You may remember that when we spoke about pre-modern history preferred to focus on narratives, preferred to focus on storytelling, and preferred to focus on the character, particularly the moral character, of people engaged in history, right? Whether this or that ruler was a good man or a bad man, whether the people working for them or fighting for them were virtuous or depraved or what, what their moral status was. Modern history, on the other hand, prefers to analyze systems, right? Prefers to analyze institutions and structures. This is very much connected to, correlates with the way that Marxists prefer to look at economies rather than ideas, right? The significant thing is for Marxists, it's not the idea that people are believing in, it's the economic systems that they are benefiting from and trying to profit off of, okay, trying to benefit from. So this sort of shift from a pre-modern approach to history to a modern approach to history is very much tied up with Marxism, and this is very significant. The other thing, of course, in Marxism is that it means that for historians who are influenced by Marx, whether they are themselves, card-carrying Marxists or not, it means that Marx gave rise to a much greater interest in the systematic study of the economic underpinnings of a society. Okay, Marx argued that it's these economic relations, it's these economic processes, economic systems, economic conflicts, which are really what's motivating human behavior and therefore are really driving change in history and causing people to do the things they do and behave the way that they do. Not necessarily, not primarily, the ideas that they have or the beliefs that they have. Okay, for Marx, the economic relations are primary, everything else is secondary. Okay, for Marx, politics, the ways that people organize and exercise their power is fundamentally a way for people to gain control of economics, right? People want power in order to guarantee wealth for themselves, right? Not many people are interested in power if there isn't wealth coming along with it, right? You want the power so that you have the wealth. So for Marx, politics are secondary to economics. They're dependent on economics. And when you get into things like, for Marx, things like morality, religion, ideology, philosophy, literature, the arts, all this other kind of stuff. For Marx, all of these are also dependent on economic relations and exist in order to justify and motivate the types of economic relations that people have. Okay, they're a part of what Marx called mystification. He argued that in order to make the bitter pill go down a little bit easier, the ruling classes produce religion, produce morality, produce art and expression and all this kind of thing, which acts in order to either directly justify their domination of the economic system, to justify their oppression of the people under them, or in order to obscure and distract people from seeing the realities of the economic relations. Okay, that's what, so Marx used this concept of mystification, that you should be able to explain all of these other phenomena in terms of the underlying economic relations. Okay, one of Marx's most famous phrases in association with this, so looking at religion in particular, Marx is famous for the sentence that religion is the opium of the people. Right, the idea being that, in his view, ruling classes use religion in order to sort of put the oppressed classes, the lower classes, the working classes, on morphine, effectively sort of, deaden their pain so that they didn't realize the ways in which they were being exploited. That's what he thought the function of religion was. Okay, so this idea for Marx, very significant. Economics is really the driving engine of history. Politics are secondary to economics. They are means that people use in order to gain control of the economic benefits. in the system, and pretty much everything else is what you call an epiphenomenon, sort of a sideshow. Not the real fundamental dynamics driving a society, but are rather sort of the byproduct of the fundamental economic relations. Okay, so that's the Marxist approach. Now, there are clearly, as you could tell from the Scott article, some historians who are whole hog Marxists, argue, yes, this or some version of this is the reality. They will tweak Marx's ideas or develop them or modify them in various ways as their ideas develop. Others who will reject a Marxist view and say, no, maybe economics isn't anything. Maybe these other variables like philosophy and art and religion actually have a life of their own and are not strictly tied to people's economic interests. You'll have people all over the thread. It's not that everybody's a Marxist or ought to be a Marxist or anything like that. It's an ongoing debate. Nevertheless, you can't underestimate the impact of Marxism on the study of history and the development of modern history in many significant ways, because Marx really did force historians to stop looking simply at ideas and some of these other kinds of things that pre-modern historians had focused on, sort of the character and morality of individuals, and instead started getting the point across that larger social structures, larger social systems often are very, very significant to understand, and that you can't just explain history in terms of the morality of individuals. You've got to look at the social systems that those individuals are embedded in, right? The frameworks within which they operate. So very, very significant to think of it in those terms. And when you look at historians, to pay attention not only to the stories of the individuals that they tell about, but also at the underlying economic systems and how those can be analyzed and how they shape the choices and actions of individuals. Okay, so I'll stop there. Hope this was useful, and I'll go on. I'll be posting these lectures from time to talk about other movements and developments within historiography that shape the way that historians approach their task today. Thank you.